Today I want to talk about something that is of general interest, but is also tangentially important to Nietzsche, but it's of a much larger significance for philosophy and for how it developed from the 18th century, in fact from the 17th century, onwards to the beginning of the 20th century, and onwards, of course. It's a particular way of thinking that is all pervasive. Take X as something that you know. Suppose that this principle holds. If I know X, then the world must be such that I can know X. And if you think about it for a minute, you'll realize it's completely obviously true. Now, this follows from a principle of modal logic. And that principle is, it is a necessary truth that if P is the case, we use P as a sort of stand-in for it because we're using general principles here. If P is the case, then P is possible. It is possible that P is the case. If P is the case, then it's possible that P is the case. Now, we represent the idea of necessity by the box symbol. The box out the front, that's out the front of the brackets, that says what follows is necessary. So what is necessary is that if P is the case, then possibly P is the case. Possible P is represented by the diamond symbol. So diamond P means P is possible, or it's possible that P. So this principle of modal logic underwrites our general principle that we had before. So, in this case, what follows if we look at an X that's not something that is known? Take another principle, try to sort of see this as some sort of some sort of relation to our first principle. Our first principle was necessarily true. Take a variant on it and see what we think of that. What happens if we take an X that we don't know? So if I don't know X, then what follows from that? Well, if I don't know X, then nothing about the world is going to follow. If I don't know X, then there's nothing I can really conclude from that. So this doesn't have any implications for what the world must be like. If I don't know X, then I might not know X for many reasons. There could be lots of causes for me not to know X. Nothing follows really from that. When we have this alternative view, we don't get any consequences for what the world is like. Now, let's look at a particular case of this, going back to Descartes, and going back to Descartes' meditations. In Meditation 1, Descartes introduces a lot of reasons for doubting many things. So he goes through a number of arguments of increasing scope and severity, as it were. And the one that he concludes with is, well, what if there were an evil demon that were deceiving me about even the existence of my body? What if I don't have a body? What if I am just a sort of a free-floating thought? What happens with that? Well, then he says, and this becomes his crucial argument in the first part of the meditations, he says, well, suppose that I am thinking, just a thinking being. Suppose that. Then what's going to follow is that I exist. Because suppose that I were to attempt to doubt that I exist, I must still exist to do the doubting. So if I try to say, well, I may not know that I exist, and that thought is a testimony to the fact that I do exist. I exist to do the thinking. So, in this scenario, I merely identify myself as the one who is the thinker of the thought. And then I must exist. So, what can we conclude from that? We can conclude that, at the very least, whatever I am something that is able to think. And I must exist because even were I to doubt that I exist, I must exist to do the doubting. So I exist, and I am at least a thinking being. Now that gives us the first part of this problem. I exist, and I exist as a thinking being. So therefore, the realm of thought, the realm of my thought, must exist. That's one world, a world of thought, a world that I can prove to myself I must exist in. Even were I to attempt to doubt it, as I said, I must exist to do the doubting. Okay, how does Descartes go from there? Well, this is something of a conundrum, because now we have two arguments that we're going to have to set side by side. We've already seen that the evil demon argument is going to seem to show us that we couldn't know that we were a body. So it seemed to have that conclusion. I can't know that I have a body. I can be in doubt about that. Well, Descartes' method here is a little bit indirect, but what he wants to say is something like this. Well, I can prove also that God exists. So I have good reason to believe that God exists. I can know that God exists. But from there, things get a little bit dicey. I can know that God exists. What about the evil demon? Well, I can get past that by saying, or Descartes gets past that by saying, well, the evil demon might exist were it not for the fact that God exists, because God is good by definition, and God would not allow me to be deceived in that matter. So God exists, and God would not allow me to be deceived very much. Therefore, he wouldn't allow me to be deceived as to the existence of my own body. So I have a body. But that doesn't seem to be as strong as an argument as the previous one for the existence of the mind. So now we have an argument that, well, I know that I exist in thought. I know that my thoughts exist. Therefore, there is a realm of thought, a world of thought. I don't know with the same degree of certainty that I have a body, though. It's reliant on God would not deceive me in that, or God is too good to allow me to be deceived in that matter. And so probably there is a world in which my body exists, but it's nowhere near the same kind of strength. So on the one hand, I have the first principle that we had. If I know X, then the world must be such that I can know X. That means there is a world of thought. Secondly, I've got this, if I think but don't know that I have a body, then what follows from that? Well, in a very weak sense, I might think that the world is such that I have a body, but it's by no means definite. So I've got these two realms now, a realm of thought and a realm of the physical, the body. The claim that I can't be deceived on that is reliant on not just the idea that God is good, but that I know what would be good, that I know that God would not do that, would not deceive me in that way. Maybe it's for the best for me to be deceived in that manner. And that weakens Descartes' arguments. I've got a weak, very weak argument, and I certainly don't know that I have a body on the arguments that I've been laying out. I might believe it, but that's all. So it's possible, perhaps, that I have a body, but it's a weak possibility, nothing other than that. It's also a possibility that I don't have a body. Perhaps God has decreed that. So, here we have an argument for what looks like a kind of two-worldsism, the idea that I live in two worlds. One is a world of the mind, the mental, and the other is a world that is the physical. And now we want to relate them to one another in some way, and that's very difficult. What Descartes opts for here is another weak link in this chain. It's the idea that the mental and the physical have to be in interaction with one another. I've got these two realms, one above and one below the physical. And somehow there's a connection between the two across this boundary. And you can raise many questions about this. What would that connection be in? Not the mental, not the physical, but some sort of realm in between. It's not clear what on earth that would be. So we've got this sort of two-worldsism with some kind of postulated interaction between the two of them that we don't really understand. I don't think Descartes thinks he understands it either. And these two give us a way of connecting these two, a causal connection that's somehow in between the two. Now, this is all very puzzling and peculiar. And as I say, Descartes seems to take it that it does give us a two-worldsism, but the connections between the two raise a lot of questions about whether any of this, or whether this other world, the physical world, has been proven. And that's really how this progressed as we go on through from Descartes onwards. Now let me say, Descartes is regarded as a rationalist. He wants to, which means that he wants to try to derive the nature of the world from reason really alone. Reason is to be our guide. Reason is to take us into more detailed aspects of the nature of reality. Given this asymmetry between our two beginning principles, what happens if I do know something, or what happens if I don't know something, there's a great asymmetry between those two. Descartes has to rely on arguments like the existence of God, the fact that God by definition must be good, etc., in order to get any consequences out. Now, many people who were in a significant contact with Descartes and were able to respond to his arguments believe that these were rather large gaps that Descartes had left in his position. One particularly was Leibniz, who was legitimately skeptical of Descartes' argument and its strength. So we have three rationalists principally. The first one really was Descartes. The second one was the philosopher Spinoza, and the third one was Leibniz. Leibniz, as it were, leading the way among the rationalists into skepticism about Descartes' arguments for this two-worldsism. Now, against the rationalists, slightly later, mostly in the beginning of the 18th century, Descartes was in the 17th. In the beginning of the 18th century, we have three philosophers that are known as empiricists. And those three empiricists are John Locke, Berkeley, the one who gave his name to the mispronounced Berkeley University, George Berkeley, or Bishop Berkeley as he's sometimes called, Bishop Berkeley, and then David Hume. Those three went on from from Descartes, and worried about the following problem. If we start with the certainty that we're supposed to have, that we have a world of thought, a world of mental sensations, as they began to call them, if we have a world that is an inner world, a world of thought, how then does it relate to anything that we could describe as external to that? This thought became more crystallized in Berkeley, Bishop Berkeley, when he took the world entirely as this inner world. So, and you have to sort of hang on to your hats on this one. Take an apple. For all the world, it looks like something that would be external. It grows on a tree. It's external to us. For Berkeley, it was an internal thing. It was in the mind. In the mind, the apple is a particular color. What is the thing that is outside in the world? Well, what is a color in the external world? There's light rays coming off the object. But are those light rays green? Are they red? According to Berkeley, no, they're just rays of light. And those rays of light do not have any intrinsic color. They are simply of a particular wavelength. So that idea, in whatever form they chose to put it in that period, is really a sort of argument for, again, this world that we live in, the apple, is not something outside. It's something inside, because it seems to have a color. And the object, if there were an object outside of us, wouldn't have a color. So Berkeley believes in an internal world entirely. And what causes all of us to have the same sensations? Because oddly enough, he believes that there are many of us in this world, all having the same sensations. It seems like a non sequitur, really, because if everything is inside, then everyone other than me is on the inside too. I only have a sense impression of them as well. Anyway, he seems to think that it needs explanation that there seem to be many people with the same sense experiences. What causes? If there's no external world, forget the contradiction that these other people seem to be in an external world, because Berkeley's view is not easily made consistent in any way. What does one say about this? Well, he wants to say something about it, and what he wants to say is that, well, we all have the same sense experience because God organizes it that we all have the same sense experience. So again, just as in Descartes, God is to the rescue, as it were, in this process. Hume has something of the same view, although he doesn't, as it were, push it into the range of absurdity that Berkeley does. Hume is rather gentlemanly, discreet as to what the natural world, which is what he calls it, what the natural world is like. He is sometimes, has to admit that there is a natural world that leads us to have the sense impressions that we do, which are the only things really that we know. But there is a natural world. That natural world is supplying us with our sensations and is the explanation for why we have them. But he doesn't say much about, he is, as it were, very discreet, very gentlemanly in refusing to go into much detail at all as to what this natural world would be like. Now we come to Kant. Kant was very directly influenced, as he himself admitted, he was very influenced by Hume's view. So what we have, whereas everything was more or less sort of clear, only more or less really, about the empiricists and their view about how we come to have the sensations that we do. Kant was much more explicit. He sort of gave names to these two things and was explicit about the need to make them relate to one another. So Kant has a phenomenal world, which is his name for the world of sense experience in Hume, which was also the world of sense experience in Berkeley and Locke. And having that, he is trying to relate it somehow to whatever it is that's causing those sensations, because even he realizes that there must be something which is causing me to have the sensations that I have. Otherwise, all I've got is sensations and no explanation at all for them. Why am I having these sensations? It seems to cry out for a world in which there is something which is doing the causing here. And that Kant calls, to everyone's regret really, but Kant calls that the noumenal world. So now we have all of this boiled down into a very definite two-worldsism. The phenomenal world, which one might call the common world, the phenomenal world, the world of apples and trees and the rest of it, the phenomenal world, and whatever it is that is causing us to have the sense experiences that we're having, and that is the noumenal world. That's the idea, and that's how you get two-worldsism. And you get the weak link here, the link that comes from that is supposed to establish the noumenal world as a postulation that is meant to give us something out of the, well, I don't know X, but something. That something turns into the noumenal world with the argument that, well, there has to be something that is causing our sense experience. There has to be something. Descartes, Leibniz, Berkeley, Hume give different names to that something. The name that ends up being attached to it in Kant is the noumenal world, the world that is behind the phenomenal world. So that's how we get to this two-worldsism. The rationalists, as it were, the descendants of Plato, the empiricists, the descendants of Aristotle, and those two traditions running through the history of philosophy to come up in this form in the early modern period. So that is how we get to two-worldsism. Now, Nietzsche, there was a long period when this didn't seem to be something that could be pushed forward. So after the very beginning of the 19th century, there's really not much. There's no further argument on this matter, so that this two-worldsism gets, by argument, collapsed into something that is more sensible than this view. Because I think, in retrospect, it doesn't seem like a very sensible view that the early moderns reached. And but if we want to decrease this two-worldsism to a one-worldsism, which is a monism, if one wants a monism, then we're going to have something, and the 19th century seemed to be nonplussed as to how to move forward on this matter. And so there's, I think, a great gap of philosophy between the early 19th century and the later 19th century. It's almost like a void, an unreasoning void where philosophy seems to have come to an end and to need something, a reasonable something, a logical something to go on with. And there really wasn't anything obvious until Nietzsche. because Nietzsche fills the gap by finding a way of, as it were, getting around this early principle. If I know X, then the world must be such that I can know X. He gets around that principle by just blatantly denying the existence of the world that we see. He's not a rationalist or an empiricist. He's the first one to make a new start and say, no, the things that we thought we knew, the basic things that we thought we knew, we don't know, because they are simply Paleolithic impositions on our cognition, which give us a way of describing the world where that way of describing it is not true. It is a world that comes from falsehoods of what is convenient for our brains to believe, which allows us to do what we need to do, to hunt, to gather the things that we need to gather. All that's required in that is baked into us from the beginning as a series of shortcuts to cognition. They're not really quite true. We can't trust the veridical world. Well, we can't trust the experiential world at all. We are not working on a system of thought which is veridical. And so that's where you get Nietzsche. He seems to be at the beginning of a long turning point where the 20th century after Nietzsche is almost entirely a monistic world, a world of just something which you could call the physical, but you don't know what the physical is. Something you could call that, but there is only one world, and the mental is somehow part of the physical. That could be described as the 20th century main view. There's not a lot of attempt to reproduce the idea of the 17th or 18th century that there is this dualism. No, that the dualism seems to have gone down, and everyone in the 20th century, really, the sensible, logical philosophers are trying to make do with just one world. So to argue that the mental must be a manifestation of the physical, however we want to conceive that. Now, Nietzsche has already gone further than that. Nietzsche believes that even the mental world is misconceived. It's full of what he calls false lights. So if we're trying to make sense of belief, motive, willpower, etc., we're again in a mistake. But I've already outlined that idea in the previous lecture. What we have is the 20th century really trying to work out in a sensible way how one could have just one world, how to explain everything with just one world. Nietzsche has gone a long way towards that goal, but most didn't read Nietzsche with an idea that he had made any contribution to metaphysics. So all of that was passed by. And if you like, what I've been trying in a small way to do is to reinstate Nietzsche's metaphysics so that we can understand it as a contribution to the 20th century project of trying to make sense of a monistic world. If we had read Nietzsche in the first place, we would not have been stuck for so long on so many pseudo-problems. Okay, that's my tribute to Nietzsche. That's my explanation for how the idea of Two-Worldsism came about. What we see is that Nietzsche is firmly against this Two-Worldsism and is trying very hard to show that it has a whole lot of ill effects, one of which is the Christian idea of a world, a fallen world of the common world, the world of sin, as it were, and a higher world as the world of the spiritual world. He says much against it over and over again, but that's how it fits into the history of philosophy. Okay, thanks.